The idea of food as simply sustenance, as a way of thinking through needs that have to be met at a very physical level, is, I think, dominant in current debates about food and food security issues in not just South Africa but the world. And this is partly because over the last few hundred years, our food supply, our understanding of food, our exchanges of food have become more and more implicated in, complicit with, and actually deeply dependent on capitalist chains of exchange of goods and capitalist flows that have, since this crisis started, been severely interrupted, if not entirely dismantled. So it's, to me, just one of the many social institutions, our economy, for example, that have not only shown up their own decayed state in this crisis, but have shown how old habits of thought and old habits of being are no longer necessarily suited to the environment that is fast evolving and emerging around, underneath, and through us. And the reason I say this in this particularly odd way is that we often imagine that rituals that may be thousands of years old around food, particularly around sacred and sacral notions of community and exchange centered on food, tend to be divorced from the processes of history. And that's only partly because we've forgotten the processes and the historical circumstances in which much of those observance rituals, many of those observance rituals, have emerged. So when we think of food, we either think of its immediate utility in our lives, whether the utility is nutritional or physical, or whether the utility is around emotional and psychological needs. What we forget is that those psychological needs are themselves part of the processes of history and the evolution of human habits of being. So when we think through the way in which the interruptions of certain rituals, because of the interruption that COVID presents to everyday life, will have interrupted not just the availability of food and its circulation, but the rituals through which that emerged. But this is not to say, and I think many people assume this, that simply left a vacuum, that what you now have is nothing, that where you had people gathering in family groups, whether it was for Pesach or whether it was for Ramadan or whether it was for Easter or for Good Friday, you now have nothing. I don't think that that is necessarily the case. What has happened is that new rituals have had to be invented and new ways of doing things have had to be invented. And this has been part of human history throughout our long experience of crisis. Many of the rituals that we observe today emerged out of those kinds of crises, whether they were crises of food scarcity, crises of insecurity, or crises of migration because of political instability. And here one is thinking simply of the three major desert religions of the Middle East. Similar kinds of traditions, I'm certain, can be traced for animist beliefs across the global south, but also for Far Eastern religions. So the reason I speak in these general terms at the beginning is that I think it's important for us to understand that South Africa and South African experiences of food scarcity and of the consequences of food exchanges, or the consequences for food exchanges during a time of crisis, this is not unique. It's not unique in the contemporary moment, and if we compare it with other societies, but it's also not unique in the historical perspective, whether it is a local historical perspective or a global historical perspective. And so when we think of rituals and food in South Africa, we, at the moment, I think, tend to think of it as lack. We tend to think of it as people who do not have food, or we tend to think of it and talk about what we don't have anymore that we had before, whether it is a family gathering around the celebration of a high holy day, or whether it is getting together in mourning at the end of funerary rites. And so this conception, I think, leaves unthought through the new rituals, the new ways of being together that are emerging precisely because of this crisis. So there are virtual dinner parties that very many middle-class people have had for birthdays or for anniversaries, that they've used social media and other technical platforms to do this through. And similar kinds of mediated interactions have been acknowledged for things like funerals, and in some religious traditions for things like weddings, where a nikah, for example, could be followed via a social media platform, or in the cases some of us have had to experience in the last 120 days, where you have to attend the funeral of a loved one virtually, where you have to follow the proceedings at a physical remove mediated to you via the social media platforms. And food, I think, is texturally different, because while you can participate in rituals long distance, it's almost impossible to share a meal in the traditional sense via virtual platforms. So what has happened is that we've seen more and more people posting images of what they're eating on social media platforms. We have a minister in government who has done this from before the COVID crisis. And part of this is because food is a way of reaching out to people and of sharing with people, and people have been particularly isolated prior to the COVID-19 crisis. They often use these platforms and food as a way of exchanging meaning with complete strangers, because let's not forget that part of the sacred sharing of food in religious and even non-religious rituals have been to, in a sense, create equality between not just people who know one another, but between people and strangers. Because if we're all eating the same food, we can't possibly be in enmity or in rival situations, because food is also potentially poison, and therefore people are sharing food because it creates an equality of risk and an equality of exposure, but at the same time an equality of exchange of emotions and value. And what we've seen in the most divided society on the planet is that in a time of crisis, people with have often reached across barriers to people without, whether this is in feeding schemes, whether this is to make up for the failures of government and of state more generally, to try and share food. And this is not just the larger NGO, NPO and charity organizations that have taken food parcels to poor communities, whether it's in the form of soup kitchens or whether it's in the form of actual groceries that get taken for people to cook, but also through church organizations, through mosques, through shuls. There has been a community effort, because I think for everybody food is central, not just to survival, but to the actual exchange of social meaning. And so I think in Cape Town there would have been particular kinds of rituals that would have had to shift. So post-funerary exchanges of food would not have been possible precisely because of the high risk that it carried. But there was also the same high risk associated with the handing out of food. And so in South Africa, the regulations that kicked in also prohibited non-accredited people from handing out food. So people who weren't licensed by government but may have done work of a certain kind prior to the Disaster Management Act's invocation would not have been able to do the same, during the lockdown process. And that interrupted further flows of not just nutrition, but of social bonds between the haves and the have-nots. Now, there are problematic ways of considering this, but we do need to bear in mind that what is exchanged in those moments is not just difference. It's not just the people who have take their excess to the people who do not have. There are bonds of connection that are constructed in that exchange that I think that those bonds are often ignored. And those bonds, are there, and they're, I think, often denied, because it's often poor people who grow our food. It's poor people who sell us our food, in the technical sense, when you go to the supermarket. If you're middle class, then the people who work in the supermarket are not necessarily in the same class position as you are. The people who own the supermarket, of course, are not in the same class position as you are either. But the reason I focus on the middle classes is that because they're so small and so marginal in the South African body politic, we often underestimate the power of their ability to project theirs as the way of life in South Africa. And so ordinary exchanges based in poverty and deprivation are often seen as signs of a kind of almost a reinstantiation of the noble savage, that people who have so little, we see them sharing, and this is considered some kind of, sign of a greater humanity. But those are simply longer standing rituals of humanity that are not about amassing resources and keeping them to yourself. And that there's a longer pattern of that in human history. And what our religious traditions, what our faith-based traditions show around food is that sharing goes back into that deep history of constructing communality, of constructing equality, and not just with people in the in-group, but also with people who are not members of the faith or not members of the religious society. And here I think it's important for us to think through the COVID crisis as not just being about lack, about being deprived of not having access to resources, but the invention of whole new rituals, whole new ways of sharing, and whole new chains of exchange and supply chains that may not have come into being had we not faced crisis. And often we forget that our current, or the ones that existed before that we're desperately trying to get back to as a society, but those supply chains emerged out of history not because of their efficiency for capitalism only, but also because they met additional needs that weren't necessarily only about nutrition or about food security or about dietary requirements. They were also about those additional emotional and spiritual and human bonds that are constructed when food becomes the center of human exchanges.